It's great to be here. I listened with really great interest to the previous presentation, which was wonderful. Where are the people who are presenting? Have they left to relax? And, you know, my short version, if I were still a reporter of that talk, would be that this was a talk about how to be a winner in the winner-take-all global economy. How to be on the right side of this very fast revolution that's happening in the world. And it's hard. It's really worth trying to do it because the rewards of winning, the personal rewards, the rewards for your company, maybe the rewards for your city, can be tremendous if you're on the right side of this big divide that we've just been hearing about. What I want to talk about is the broader consequences of this big transformation that's happening. The broader economic, social, and political consequences, and maybe conclude by talking about what we can try to do about it. So I want to start with the observation that, and I think it's a lot due to some of the economic forces we've been seeing played out in a company and in an industry, we are living in a time of tremendous and growing income inequality. And the particular feature of the income distribution today is a huge and growing share of income at the very, very top. So let me give you just a few data points to give you a sense of where we are and why this time it really is different. In the 1970s, roughly 1% of the income in the roughly 10% of the income in the United States went to the top 1%. Today, that has more than doubled, and that number is around 22, 23%. So between the 1970s and today, you've seen this huge surge in the share of national income going to the very top in the US. What's even more striking is for the 0.1%, so the top 10% of the 1% now gets about 8% of the national income. So the top 10% of the 1%, when it comes to share of income, is roughly where the 1% in its entirety was in the 1970s. That's a really, really big shift. Let me give you a few points on talking about wealth, not just income. And this is a calculation that Robert Reich did. He calculated that if you took the wealth of two admittedly really rich guys, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, their wealth is equivalent to the wealth of the bottom 120 million Americans, or the bottom 40%. Oxfam recently did a similar calculation on a global level, and they found that if you took the top 85 richest people in the world, their wealth is equivalent to the wealth of the bottom 3.5 billion. So 85 people and half of the world. Now, interestingly, Warren Buffett himself, even though he's in the very, very top, is a very acute observer and critic of what's going on. And he himself has a favorite data point of how much has changed really recently. So the number that he likes to use, and you could read this in the New York Times, but also in one of my favorite news sources, Buffett on Jon Stewart, he pointed out that since 1992, the wealth of the fortune of the Forbes 400 was, so the 400 richest people in America, was 300 billion. So just think about it. In 1992, you didn't even have to be a billionaire to get on the list. Kind of shocking. By 2012, that figure had quintupled to 1.7 trillion. And of course, the equivalent hasn't happened to the wealth of the American middle class. Really interestingly, the financial crisis hasn't changed the trend. And we sort of can see that now from the perspective of 6 years ago. But it's worth pausing for a minute and remembering that wasn't at all obvious at the time. And I know that because September 2008 was an important moment in the world. Lehman went bankrupt. It looked like we were on the verge of the Great Depression. In my own personal life, it was very important because I finally got a book deal to write this book that became Plutocrats. And when the financial crisis happened, I had this very sort of ignoble thought, which was, oh my God, this is terrible, not because the world is in meltdown, but because I can't write my book anymore. It seemed to me completely self-evident that this phenomenon of the plutocracy was going to be over with the financial crisis. It just was impossible to imagine it would continue. I actually wrote a whole new book proposal. It was going to be called Survivors, and it was going to be about how people made it and did totally new things to run their businesses in this new political paradigm. So, of course, it didn't turn out that way. And a really interesting data point from this data series that Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty update every year on top incomes, they found that actually the recovery in the United States, such as it has been from the financial crisis and the subsequent recession, has really been a 1% recovery. So between 2009 and 2011, there was a recovery in incomes, and the top 1% accounted for 121% of that recovery, which means, of course, that the bottom 99% in that period of recovery, their incomes decreased by 0.4%. So I have mostly been citing US data, and I know that this is a very global audience. And I think it's really important to emphasize when you're talking about what's happening to the income distribution, the extent to which this is a really global phenomenon. So there's a great paper that I think makes this point. It's by a guy called Branko Milanovic. People who are sort of research junkies can look it up later, or you can look it up on your phones now. He was an economist at the World Bank, is now at CUNY in New York. And Branko set out to answer in economic history a kind of fun question. His question was, who is the richest person who ever lived? And this is an academic setting, so people will immediately say, come on, that's not possible to answer. How can you compare the ownership of slaves with the ownership of a private jet? How can you do that over time? So Branko is not a dumb guy, and the way he got around this was his unit of comparison over centuries was how many hours of your compatriots' labor would your fortune buy? And he does the Roman patricians, he does the Renaissance princes, he does the American robber barons, and Branko's calculation is the richest person who ever lived in human history is Carlos Slim. And I love that finding because it says two powerful things. One is that really this gap is a new historical thing. This isn't a question of the rich have always been with us. We're living through something that is quantitatively different. And second, it really underscores the extent to which this is something which is global. So what's going on? What are the drivers? If you look in the economic literature about what's happening, you very quickly find that there is a very strong correlation between an economist or a political scientist's general personal political views and the explanations that he or she tends to reach for. So the preferred set of explanations on the left is that this is really a phenomenon of rent-seeking and neoliberalism, that this is about crony capitalism in its various guises, most nakedly evident in some emerging markets, like the loans for shares deal in Russia, but also in financial deregulation, weakening protections for unions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the preferred version on the left. The preferred version on the right is to talk about how really what's going on is a set of very fundamental and actually probably pretty good economic processes. That this is essentially the result of globalization and the technology revolution. Exactly the kind of stuff we were just learning, those waves that we were learning how to surf in the previous presentation. Personally, I think it's both. I think that there is a lot of rent seeking going on, but I think that the underlying drivers are these big economic forces. And I actually think that makes it a more worrying phenomenon. Because if what we are dealing with is purely the result of rent seeking, at least intellectually, that is not hard to deal with. I've interviewed a lot of plutocrats and a lot of oligarchs, and I have never interviewed one who thinks that he's a rent seeker. Everybody is, at an intellectual level, opposed to rent seeking. So, you talk to the Silicon Valley guys, they hate rent seeking, and they think, financial deregulation, Wall Street guys, heads I win, tails you lose. They think that's terrible. They're ready, to rail against it as much as any Occupy Wall Street person is. You go to Wall Street, talk to the hedge fund guys. They too hate rent seeking, and they see that rent seeking is happening in the big, too big to fail investment banks. Say, we're not the rent seekers, we're allowed to fail. But the really interesting thing is, talk to a Russian oligarch, and a Russian oligarch will tell you rent seeking is a terrible thing. And the place that my Russian oligarchs see rent seeking is in the senior executive classes of publicly traded Western companies. They say those guys are like the Yugoslav workers collective. They pay themselves a huge amount of money. They don't really do that much in the company. We had to hustle to make our money. So I think getting an intellectual consensus around the idea that rent seeking is bad is easy to do. Of course, the politics of getting rid of it is incredibly difficult. But to me, the really hard intellectual problem for everybody is, how do you deal with a global economy right now where even if we were perfect in terms of getting rid of rent seeking, it just didn't exist. I think that because of the winner-take-all nature of the technology revolution, which is magnified and multiplied by globalization, you would still have this growing income inequality. And the results are politically, and probably even in terms of the macroeconomy, really hard for us to deal with. I'd like to talk just a little bit about the nature of these super rich, and then talk about what that means when it comes to thinking about a political solution. And I think it's worth singling out two really important qualities of this sort of global super elite. The first one, and again, this is something you tend not to hear too much from a left critique of what's going on, but it is true. This is an elite which is quite strongly meritocratic, and more meritocratic than previous economic elites have been. That's sort of the paradox there. There's a very good study done by Steve Kaplan at the University of Chicago of the Forbes 400 list over time. And what he did is he coded the people on that list, sorting them into people who were self-made and who inherited their money. And it's important to be clear, self-made, it didn't mean like you were born in the ghetto. You could be born into an affluent upper middle class family. But self-made meant you didn't inherit your firm from your dad. So Bill Gates on this coding counts as self-made. And what he found is really striking, that in 1982, 40% of the people on the Forbes 400 list counted as self-made. In 2011, it was up to 69%. So even as we have seen income inequality surging, we've seen the people sorted into that group tending to be more, they built it themselves. The other characteristic that I think is really important to note is increasingly, because the economy is global, because the technology revolution allows us, even requires us to operate on a global scale, you're increasingly seeing this formation of a transnational community of peers who have more in common with each other than they do with their own communities back home. And the person who expressed this sort of most strikingly for me was Glenn Hutchins, who I'm sure people around here know, co-founder of the private equity firm Silver Lake. And here's how he put it. A person in Africa who runs a big African bank and went to Harvard Business School has more in common with me than he does with his neighbors. And I have more in common with him than I do with my neighbors. Beijing can look a lot like New York. You see the same people, you eat in the same restaurants, you stay in the same hotels. And what I love about that comment, about that observation, which I think is 100% true to Glenn's life, is I can assure you, take a regular person from New York and a regular person from Beijing and put them in each other's cities for 30 seconds, and they know they're not at home anymore. Beijing and New York don't look at all alike. But in the world that Glenn inhabits, they really look the same. You know, you stay in the same hotel, you stay in the Four Seasons, you eat in the Four Seasons restaurant, you have the same menu. And really strikingly, you see really the same people in those restaurants, whether you're in Beijing or New York or Dubai. The final thing that I'd like to sort of talk about with this super elite is the way in which a meritocratic elite, which, you know, when I started this research, I thought, like, that's great, right? That's going to be a real positive. And in so many ways it is. It can also be a distancing from the problems of the people left behind. Because if you built it yourself, there's a tendency to look at the people who didn't and to kind of say, well, hey, I did it. Why didn't you do it? And I'm going to read you two quick quotes, and then I'm going to wrap up with a thought on what we can do about it. The quotes are, first of all, one from Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And at the time I talked to him, he was the richest man in Russia. He hadn't been arrested yet. You know, I also want to say I admire him hugely, and I think what he's doing now, having been released, is really important. And personally, I would be prepared to bet a small amount of money, if you give me good odds, that Khodorkovsky will one day be president of Russia. I don't know if, I know there are some Russian experts here, maybe they'll take my trade. But at the time Khodorkovsky was running high, he was an oligarch, sort of in full, a man in full. And he had just lost a lot of money in the Russian default and devaluation. And he blamed the manager of his bank. And he said to me, it was my own dumb fault, because I should have known. The guy wasn't an oligarch, so that meant he must be deficient in some way, so of course he was going to screw up. And here's how Khodorkovsky put it to me. If a man is not an oligarch, something is not right with him. Everyone had the same starting conditions. Everyone could have done it. And that really captured, I mean, he has subsequently told me he regrets saying that to me, but it captured very authentically his perspective. And just lest you think it's just the Russians, I spoke in 2012, just during the Republican primaries, with Foster Friess. He's the Wyoming Mutual Fund investor who is a big, big funder of Rick Santorum. And he's very, very worried about debt and deficit. Got it, wrapping up. And so I talked to him about that and about, you know, maybe Americans should pay higher taxes to pay down the debt. And here's some of what he said. I think we should get rid of taxes as much as we can, of course. But then an interesting perspective on who should be paying the taxes that are paid. If you look at what Steve Jobs has done for us, what Bill Gates has done for society, the government ought to pay them. Why do they collect money from Gates and Jobs for what they've contributed? It's ridiculous. It's the top 1% that probably contributes more to making the world a better place than the 99%. I've never seen any poor people do what Bill Gates has done. I've never seen poor people hire many people. So I think we ought to honor and uplift the 1%, the ones who have created value. Again, a strongly expressed point of view, but there are remnants of it in a lot of people who are more careful about what they say when journalists' video cameras are rolling. My concluding point, it might sound a little bit paradoxical, given what I've said. I think that one of the key challenges and one of the lines that is going to divide successful societies from unsuccessful societies is the successful societies will be the ones whose plutocrats, and actually we all want plutocrats, right? Like the only thing worse for a country than having Silicon Valley and the Google bus protests, only thing worse is not having Silicon Valley. So that's the paradox, right? So you need these guys. The successful societies are going to be the ones where that elite rediscovers a sense of social inclusion. And I mean that in a very deep way. I think we have to go back to the attitude. There's a great book by a guy called Mark Mizruchi called The Fragmentation of the American Corporate Elite about the ways in which the 1950s US business elite had a much deeper and broader sense of community responsibility than you see today, and that it's become fractured. Lobbying now is about your company, not about a sense of what's good for the whole country. I think the countries that succeed are going to be the ones where the elite finds it in itself. It's going to be really hard to actually say, yeah, I'm one of the winners. I'm one of the guys who went to this great Harvard conference. I figured out which side of the revolution to be on. My company is doing very well, thank you. But I am only going to succeed long term. Frankly, I'm only going to have the social license to continue to operate if we find some ways to make capitalism work better for the community at large. And the way I run my company, maybe the rules about how companies are run in my country are going to have to change to find a way that this economic growth, that this technology revolution, globalization can be shared more widely. And the reason it's going to have to, the reason I really believe this idea of an inclusive capitalism is going to have to, at least in part, be carried by the capitalists is, I know, it's my last sentence. We now know that Marx was wrong. The Soviet Union has collapsed, and it's non-trivial that Piketty starts Capital by saying that. So we don't have an alternative, thank God. We've gone down that route, it didn't work. So we're going to have to make things work with the guys who are the best businessmen we have. And they are going to have to work at it too. I know a lot of you here belong to that group. And my really strong plea is, yeah, you're going to spend 90% of your time figuring out how for yourself and your business to be on the right side of the revolution. In the other 20%, remember that 99% of your society inevitably is on the wrong side of it. This is a winner-take-all dynamic. Most people are not going to win the lottery. And for us to be healthy societies, for us to be democracies, and to be nakedly self-interested, for people to have the social license to practice capitalism, we're going to have to work together to figure out ways to make it work a lot better for everybody else. Thanks a lot.